Oh my goodness. Well, I will give a little bit of background because several of you have never seen me before. So, I've been involved in oh, she found it. Do you want me to? My very first memories include the First Unitarian Church in Hyde Park in Chicago. And my first flower communion when I was 5 years old, and helping to ring the church bell. It's actually a very Gothic building, being in the University of Chicago area. And however, I left at the age of 7 because, well, Sunday school was about art and science, and I didn't do that at school, and I wanted to understand the spirit stuff. So I went on to other things and got involved in a choir in a Baptist church and got involved in a choir in a Presbyterian church, and on my 16th, almost my 16th birthday, was asked to do a Sunday sermon, but I had just become agnostic. So I used Khalil Gibran as my text. The prophet. That worked. And then I went off to college just after my 17th birthday and got involved in this strange field called anthropology. I had thought I was going to be pre-med. Anthropology was me. And the art and the people and the understanding of possibilities and the ability to use chemistry and biology and math and everything all in one place was just too juicy. So comparative religions was the class that got me really hooked and woke me up to a different form of agnosticism. It had been, how can we possibly know that there is anything like divinity out there? And it shifted to, every human culture on the planet thinks there is something like divinity. Maybe I ought to think about this. Went on through college, married a Catholic, became a Navy wife. A Catholic Navy wife, that's an interesting world, I gotta tell you. And did that for a while. He got out of the Navy, we went back to grad school, got a degree in first in environmental studies and then cybernetics. Became a futurist working with Willis Harman and Mark Markley and Dwayne Elgin, Voluntary Simplicity, Dwayne Elgin, at Stanford Research Institute. We had a consultant come down and he said, you know, if you'll come up to my school in Portland State University, I'll pay your way for a doctorate. I said, yeah. So I went up to Portland State and got a PhD in systems theory and methodology. And the whole time I'm interested, this is all the outer things, but the whole underlying thing is what is the nature of consciousness? And what is the relationship between our consciousness and our culture? What is going on in our culture? Why are we destroying ourselves? Why are we becoming less and less healthy? Why are we destroying our environment? You know, the environmental studies degree, there's a reason for that. Why are we not living the heavenly life that the science fiction writers promised us in the 50s and 60s? Those were the questions I was asking myself. And as I completed the degree and went on to teach in colleges and universities up and down the West Coast, ran a program at San Jose for a while, helped design a program at Antioch in Seattle, and was the director of curriculum at Road Community College and Grants Pass for a while. And I was doing this academic stuff and the body was getting sicker and sicker. I did not like my doing this work in this role. I have 2 kids and a husband and working full time and getting a doctorate and all that good stuff. And the body just said, no, not happening anymore, and put me flat on my back. And as those of you who attended yesterday know what that means. The inner self was saying, pay attention. I'm trying to reach you. You are not listening. I'm going to stop everything you're doing until you listen. So I went on a healing journey that brought me into the world of metaphysics. And I've been teaching metaphysics pretty much ever since. And as I shared this morning with breakfast was, last February was 20 years after my ordination, and I officially retired, having given my 1,000th Sunday talk.
This is 1001?
No, this is about 1020. But I'm not doing it from the same place anymore. For those 20 years, it was, I'm part of your church community. How can we help this church community, this congregation, become more? And somewhere in there, I helped create the Grants of Past Fellowship in Unitarian Fellowship, which is where I met Tony and Wheel, by the way. So it's particularly meaningful to me that this is his transition. And one of the huge things that I learned along the way is that the surface story of Western culture that we've been taught in school and read in history books is not what's really been going on. There's been this underlying something unfolding and shifting and changing, and I want to touch on that today. That underlying story. It began to surface a little bit in the 70s and 80s when people started calling themselves neo-pagans. And the Unitarians, the Unitarian Universalist Association, is one of the places where they felt free to surface. It's one of the reasons I encourage Unitarian fellowships. Because in the Unitarian Universalists, it's okay to be whatever you are. Congratulations. And the pagans and neo-pagans began to go back into the deeper histories, the underlying story, and they went into the Wiccan literature and went into the archaeological and rare books shelves and found that there was a way of understanding our relationship to the earth and to the sun that we had forgotten in Western culture. Western culture is based on the idea that nature is something to be controlled, and we are to separate ourselves from as much as possible. And the neo-pagans, the Wiccans say, we are a part of that. And that the processes that we call natural processes are in fact alive in us. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson would have definitely approved. And I have some books on the back, we can talk about that later. But one of them is an interpretation of some of his essays. And in his essay, Nature, he is absolutely clear that the processes and the unfolding of nature is what is happening in each and every one of us, and we can learn about us when we look at nature. So the Wiccans brought this more and more into our awareness, and we began to become aware that there's another name for Halloween. Most of us don't know how to pronounce it, but there is another name. It's spelled Samhain, and that's a Welsh word, and like all Welsh words, it does not pronounce the way it's spelled. It's Samhain. Okay, Samhain. Samhain is that midpoint between the autumnal equinox and the winter solstice, the midpoint. And people began to wake up. And they began to become aware that May Day has another name, Beltane. May Day, which many people have heard about dancing around maypoles, that ancient Wiccan Celtic tradition that honors the mother. So the month of May is the month of the mother, and it is in the Catholic tradition the month that's devoted to Mary, and in the Wiccan tradition it's the goddess in the mother form. And we began to be aware that the phases of the moon were related to this goddess presence, right? And the mother form, the full moon, the fullness. And then in her decline, she moves into the crown, and then she disappears, and then she emerges as the maiden. And the maiden is honored in the Wiccan tradition at the beginning of February. We call it Groundhog Day. In the Wiccan tradition, it is Imbolc, which means in milk. It is when, after the long, dark days of the winter, the deepest parts of winter, the lambs are born and the ewes have milk. And so now there is something else to eat, and the fast begins in a different way. In milk. And everyone wears white, and we honor the bride, which is how you spell, it's pronounced B-R-I-D-G-I-T, bride. Wearing white. I won't say anymore. All right, so we began to become aware of this, And some of us were aware that Christmas has another name, Yule, and that there were a lot of traditions that had nothing to do with Christianity that we all do long about December 25. Well, which happens to be the third day after the night of December 21. It's the morning after the 3 days that the sun has stood still at the winter solstice. And it is the traditional day when the masculine form of the divinity is born. Has been that traditional day for about 5,000 years now too. Some of this is outlined in a book over there called Mary's Call. If we begin to recognize that there is a much more ancient set of traditions that we are a part of, and that the natural cycles of the earth and the sun are part of what we have been feeling and honoring in other ways for a very long time, then we can begin to relax into it. The body, everything that is material, everything we own, everything we touch is of the earth. It is matter. Matter, from the Latin mater, material, matrix, mother. It is of the mother. Every material thing. So we begin to feel that and know that this body is part of this earth and its relationship with the sun and the moon and the other beings and essences in the world around us, the universe around us. And so in the deep winter time we have been quiet. We have celebrated the light, the return of the light, and then we've gone into the quiet and allowed, as the song suggested, thank you for keeping that, allowed the beauty that is winter to begin to embrace us and fill our hearts and minds with possibility and potential. We plan a little bit, we dream a little bit. And then as Involt comes, that point between the winter solstice and the vernal equinox, that midpoint, we move into a new kind of a widening. The white flowers, the white blossoms, the snowdrops come up, the little green leaves, the little bit of greens. We replace the ancient, the now ancient Christmas greens, Yule greens, with the fresh greens that are beginning to emerge among the snows. And as we move into the vernal equinox, it is in the Hebrew term Pesach, the beginning, that transformation of that Passover time at the vernal equinox, when what seemed to be dead is now coming to life. And we experience the resurrection of new life. And we move into then that midpoint between the spring equinox and the summer solstice, which is Beltane, May Day, celebrating the aliveness of everything. Tra-la, it's May! Right? And we're just so alive and aware. Spring fever, oh my! You know, and all of that through this merry month of May. And we experience that delight, and then the beginnings of the warm, golden dryness of the June. I happened to be driving in Northern California last weekend, and it was, that point where the May green, you've had green from December to May, right? The only time it's green, December to May. And then it's all but under the shades has begun to, shady trees, under the shade, it's begun to turn golden. So there's just these tiny little bits of green left. And all that golden grass, all those hills covered in golden richness. Quite apart from the drought. This is not about the drought. This is the cycle. Okay? So June, we begin to feel that burgeoning warmth. And, we've done the spring planting if we're in an agricultural or a horticultural world. And we're beginning to do the June deadheading, or even the gathering. I came down the back way from Portland on Thursday, back around behind McMinnville and Manhill and back in, love that road, Moore Valley Road, if you get a chance to take that road. And, the crates are out by the blueberry plants and the strawberries. You can see the red through the green. And the cherry trees, they're in all that glowing red and green. And so we begin to become aware that the earth is fruitful in June. And we begin to become aware of the ways in which life is giving back to us. We're no longer eking out a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. We're beginning to feel that wonderful, joyful gift that is this life that we love. And now it is the solstice. It is still the solstice, by the way. It is a 3-day process. There is a point which our modern science says, this is the point at which the sun is furthest south, and we will call that point solstice. No. Sol, sun, stise, standing sun. The sun stands still for 3 days. Actually, no, excuse me. From the furthest north today, furthest south in the winter. So the sun is at its furthest north point sometime yesterday, and it appears to be rising and setting in the same place for 3 days. The sun is setting. The sun is standing still in that point. And so there is the realization, we can't do this. And the further north, how many of you have been in Alaska or northern climes this time of year? This is the white nights, yeah? Did you see the Baryshnikov Gregory Hines film, White Nights? Powerful film. What it's like when the sun never sets, and the kind of energy you feel, and the kind of nervousness that kind of goes with that energy because you aren't sleeping. Yeah, it's as far north as it's going to be, and there is no break. It is all night, all the time. And you begin to become aware of, oh my goodness, that we need a shift. We need this to shift. And so, how many of you saw the videos, online streaming videos at Stonehenge Friday, Saturday? Oh my goodness, you can see the archives now if you want, but they're still there. Thousands of people have just taken over. You know, there's rules about Stonehenge. You can't go in with the rocks anymore. They don't care. There are thousands of following the rocks. You know, and it's just amazing. They're just being alive. Some of them are eating and drinking, and some of them are praying, and some of them are looking at the horizon. They're just being there, feeling thousands of years. We know of at least 10,000 years of human beings showing up at that place at this time of year to honor the relationship between the earth and the sun. Between our bodies and the earth and the sun. Between our spirit and our awareness of the relationship that we are a part of. The interconnected web of life that we are part of. That the sun and the earth and the moon together dance the dance. They are the conductors, and we are the instruments. And so now we come to what has happened historically at this time of year. I mentioned that historically at the spring equinox, well, at the Yule, the male form of the god is born, and at the spring equinox, he is killed and resurrected, and that is long before Jesus ever is said to have walked the planet. And that idea of dying and resurrecting at the spring equinox comes into a different form at the summer solstice. At the summer solstice, the king is being recognized as fully mature male. This is a story that comes out of the fact that all that grass is golden, all those grains in the mid-level temperate climates are golden. The grain has achieved maturity. That which was dead, the seed, has planted and was resurrected as green and is now reaching its maturity as a leader. In the Christian tradition, this would normally be honored by Pentecost, which is another Hebrew festival long before Christianity took it on. This is when the Spirit comes alive in us. The Spirit that guides us. The Spirit that gives us the power over heaven and earth. The Spirit that is called in the Christian tradition Holy Spirit, in the Hebrew tradition Shekinah. A very feminine voice, alive in the masculine. So at the summer solstice, what we have is the fullness and maturity of the masculine presence, and that fullness is honoring the presence of the feminine divinity merging together. So we kind of have this balance. We have the Yule, the God is born, Imbolc, the maiden is honored. The spring equinox, the God is dead and resurrected, and in the green, in May, we honor the mother. The winter solstice, the God is in his fullness. Our next midpoint is called Lamas, Lothnas, or Lunasa. And that's the end of July, beginning of August. And then we have the autumnal equinox. Right now, the king is the high king. Arthur has all his power. Peter and Paul are in their power in the Christian tradition. All the way through, we can go back and further back. If you look at the wall charts of history, I mean, got one of those wonderful wall charts of history. I love those things. Great fun. You can get them at Barnes & Noble updated. They were done in the 1890s. But if you get a sense of the high king in his full power, this is when all the jousting matches will be held. This is when the summer fairs happen. This is when people come together. This is when new possibilities are beginning to unfold in the life of the people. Because the first harvest of the hay has happened. Everything is in its ripeness. The earth is giving us the food. All is well in human life. And we honor that in the summer solstice. Now it happens that American Congress has been charged with the Constitution never to establish a religion. And so we've done some interesting things around that. We put Mother's Day in the month of May, the second Sunday in May. And we put Father's Day in the month of June. In fact, we put it on the third Sunday of June. And isn't that interesting? That's the Sunday closest to the solstice. And the 4th of July. We actually get to set off fireworks at the time when, guess what? Virtually every culture on the planet does the same. But there's something that has to happen in order for maturity to be used and experienced. Something must happen. There must be a clearing. There must be a releasing and letting go in order for fullness of maturity. And so one of the things that goes on at this time of year, this is the wounding time as well. This is the time when we lose much that we have placed a lot of attachment. This is when the healer becomes the wounded healer. The king enters into the unforgivable battle, the battle he avoided all of his life. This is when there is a sense of betrayal and breaking down. And it's all so that the new can come in its place. We have to harvest that right grain. We must cut down the cane. We must let go of what has been the most important thing to us. And that is hard in our culture especially. We're not trained to allow the opening and releasing and receiving process. We're trained to take and hold as tight as possible. And the holding itself can become painful. But we must release. We must allow the cycle. We must allow the flow. We are living beings. We are not statues. We cannot stay in one state. We are constantly unfolding, becoming more. There's an ecologist, C.S. Holling, known as Chip. Chip Holling has this wonderful notion that he's created. It's like an infinity sign. You all know this infinity sign, right? It's like a sideways figure. And in Holling's notion, what he's done is he has said, we start out as a seed. And the seed whatever form it is, whether we're talking about trees or human bodies, or organizations, churches, congregations. We have the seed, and the seed begins to take form on its own because that's a natural process. It begins to become something, and we watch it, and we nurture it, and we support it. We have a vision with that seed of what's possible, and so we move up to the top of the one side of the figure 8, and we have that vision. We see that vision come into fruition. Yes. And we bring other people on board, and more components. The tree becomes a forest. You know, the seedling becomes a tree with branches, and it becomes more and more beings are brought into it. We start imposing structure. We impose structure because, well, you've got to have some way to communicate. You've got to have some way to move things through the system that is unfolding. And so we're down, we come around to the other side. Now we have a structure that is growing. It is growing, and it is getting more and more complex and more weird. And less able to respond to the environment that is constantly, has been its whole life, impinging on it and affecting it. This is the stage that most of Western culture is at today. We have reached that point where the structure has reached its greatest complexity and its least flexibility, and the next small little fluctuation in the environment could lead to we don't know what. And so then there is this thing over on the other end. We started out down here, we moved all the way around, and there is this time of unknown. Most of us call that chaos. This time we have no idea what's going to happen. How is this going to unfold? Everything's breaking apart. I can't stand it. And out of that, the new seeds. This is where we are today. In our culture, in our country, in our communities, in our personal lives, in consciousness for humanity, and in the dance of the earth, the sun, and the moon. The seed exists in each and every one of us. Please, discover the seed. Nurture it. It is the seed of incredible new life for all beings. Thank you.